Okay, welcome everybody. Why don't we start? Why don't we start with Laura? Why don't you do your introductions and work our way down?
Sure. My name is Laura Aguilar. Glad to be here. Great morning and hoping for a great conversation here as well. I'm a director of surveillance design and research with Citi, where I lead a team of data scientists, and we're in charge of designing our trade and communication surveillances.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bill Rowe, Vice President of Central Compliance at Cantor Fitzgerald, supporting all of our global affiliates and also the Global Head of eComms Compliance at Cantor. Thank you all for coming out today.
And thanks, everyone. Robert Cruz, I'm VP of Information Governance for SMARSH. My team is consisting of regulatory advisors that work with our clients, both the global banks as well as the broker-dealers, investment advisors. How do you define best practices around electronic communications? How do you ensure that you're dealing with some of the risks that are present in Slack and Teams and WhatsApp and et cetera? And SMARSH, for those of you that don't know, we're outside, but we provide technology that allows firms to capture, store, and surveil electronic communications.
Okay, well, thanks everybody. I am told to remind everybody to submit questions via the Brella app. I will also note that the Brella app is probably not being captured in any compliance archive as you chat along. Okay, it just sort of shows you the problems that everyone is dealing with in terms of trying to capture communications in this day and age where it's constantly changing. So let's start with the elephant in the room, and I'll start with you, Laura. We all know of the big fines that came out. Now it's more than a year ago. They continue to come out. We all expect them to continue to come out. There's been public filings about, some of the private equity and investment advisors are going to be probably hit pretty soon. So what lessons have been learned from a lot of these fines and the inadequate monitoring and capture of communications?
Right. I think the main one, at least in my perspective, is the importance, the necessity of really capturing the channels. So identifying channels and make sure that you capture those communication channels. And broadly, really having a structure, and I think we're going to touch a little bit on the culture later on, a whole structure of policies, training, communication within the firm on the importance of what the policy is, what's the content of the policy, which channels are approved, which ones are not, what to do in certain cases, and to really educate, communicate, and train people on that, and really have a comprehensive approach that you show that you really treat this seriously.
Bill?
Yeah, I totally agree, Laura. And, in addition to that, as the complexity of some of these channels and data flows and data life cycles increases, I think the collaboration within this industry, especially in compliance or surveillance, is even more important than ever. I've spoken with many of you today, and we have many of the same problems. We really do. But when we're able to come together like today, we're really able to drive innovation and further secure the integrity of our financial markets. So I think that's important, having these conversations. And, I think it's really encouraging that we all took the time out of our days to do so.
Yeah. I'm going to echo both of your comments. And I think one of the fundamental problems is that it's not a one-dimensional problem. This is not just about how do you surveil communications. It's a three-dimensional problem. It's one, the investor wants to interact on their own preferred set of networks, things they're familiar with. Each is different. Second is your advisor or broker-dealer has their preferences as well as things they use internally. And then third is using some combination of technologies to provide inspection and oversight. And those may have some understanding of what those first two individuals are using, and it may not. So it's really the complexity of the issue I think we're dealing with. It's not about WhatsApp. It's not about mobile devices. It's making sure you have controls that are elastic to address all three of these dimensions.
Yeah, and I think one of the challenges, and the Brella app is a classic example, is the way the technology and innovation is going with collaboration, constant communication. Just about every vendor, every application in every environment has some chat function, some communication function. They're all doing the same thing. It's where innovation is going. And I think one of the challenges that you're all dealing with is how do you balance, right? It's how do you balance the 1,000 apps that you have to deal with and figure out prioritization. What are we capturing? What are we not? What can we turn off? So let's just go in terms of some of the changes that have happened. I'll start with you, Bill. So how, and we started talking about this, how has it changed? The surveillance, capture, compliance generally. How has it changed over the past 5 years? What are the challenges that you're really seeing?
Yeah, the pace of growth, of course, is exponential, and it's going to keep growing that way. And as I alluded to in the first response, that the complexity of the channels and just the sheer volume of data is going to continue to grow beyond our wildest imaginations. So I think it's really, taking a step back and trying to understand your risk posture. Where in the data life cycle, where in the software cycle, do your risks, primary risks lie? I think that's a pretty significant piece of this puzzle.
Yeah.
And Robert, could you talk about, one of the challenges obviously is there's all different types of communications channels, and I know Smarsh deals with that in terms of people want to ingest stuff. And, a text message is not the same as a Teams message, is not the same as an email, it's not the same as some structured database that you're trying to capture. So.
I think that's a big part of it, is that this is a big data problem. Just the idea that variety is an important aspect, but so is, the volume, the variety, and the veracity. The fact that, you're not just looking for needles in haystacks, you're looking for, tax in quinoa and wheat fields full of they're all forms and fashions of different information. At the end of the line, though, the person that's doing the surveillance, needs to be able to understand context. And so how do you do that if it's Slack or TikTok or something else? It's like having a way to interpret meaning and what took place in a conversation, I think, is one of the fundamental tasks that AI helps. I can't say that that's the ultimate answer for firms to be able to deal with this more effectively, but that to me is the big problem that firms are faced with, just the variety of information.
Yeah, and Lord, along those points, obviously, just from a pure surveillance perspective, and I think this is one of the things to keep in mind, is when you start thinking about, should I capture something, right? Maybe you talked about figuring out what you need to capture, like all the stakeholders that should be there, right? Because just capturing it isn't enough, as Robert said, you're going to have to surveil it, you're going to have e-discovery. Like, how do you manage that? Like, how do you get all the stakeholders to actually focus on this? Not just, yes, we should capture everything, which I hear, I think I have several clients who, like, that's their view, is we should capture everything because we just got fined, or we're going to get fined, so we have to capture everything, and it's not realistic. So how do you deal with that?
Right. So we talked about what's new, but I think what you mentioned, Robert, what's fundamental, what's not new, what's always been there in the business of what we do in surveillance, which is really where we're here in the business of identifying, mitigating risk. And specifically in the communications space, it's really not just the text itself. What makes it an interesting and a tough problem, you're dealing with language. It's ambiguity. That's just the first level. Second, is it language by people who behave. So when you talk about the different ways of, it's not just capturing it, but how do you make sense of it? So that goes into the effectiveness of your approach to surveillance. Are you just doing, ChatGPT can help, yes, with the context, but are you connecting the other dots? Like, who is speaking with whom? What else are they doing? And can you really make sense of that to holistically look at the risk? And just the last point of this, paradoxically, or maybe not, if you do that well, the challenge of volume and complexity might be bridged, because one way to deal with just massive alert volumes is and complexity is, if you're able to connect the complex dots, then you're able to just focus on the cream, and then you reduce the volume. That's not an easy problem, but if you can do that, you're able to hit both of them.
Yeah. If I could add to that, I think the language is a good example, but the other examples are things like video and voice and whiteboards and emojis. There was an emoji on the screen earlier today. A lot of these conversations are becoming much less text-centric, and just the way the conversation is carried out entails a lot of different modalities. So if you think about this, trying to ultimately do something with this conversation in surveillance, it's like you have one giant document that's almost fully redacted. The redacted stuff is what you weren't able to capture, what you can't decipher or understand. So it's really trying to find a better way to be able to interpret all these other ways that communications are happening, because that's a conversation fully encoded in emojis is already referenced in court decisions, and that's going to continue to happen both on the regulatory side as well as litigation.
Yeah, and I think, and again, I think to put this, to make it real in terms of, if there's a bad transaction, like let's assume there's a bad actor, like when you're thinking about, okay, there's a transaction where they did bad things, if they're on a Teams call, right, there's all kinds of information they can have. They may be chatting, they may be using, they may have been doing it audio video, they may have done a whiteboard, they could have done lots of different ways to do this. But then they also may be, doing the transaction in a transactional database where there's a chat, where they're doing some of the same language, maybe using some of the same language or whatever, but it's finding all those pieces. And it could be a text message as well, right? If you're a bad actor, you're probably using all these different places where you think you can get away with it. And I think that's one of the challenges, is how do you do that? And I think it also brings a challenge. And again, just to put in this perspective, 5 years ago, I think you'd be pretty comfortable saying, I've got their email. If there's a transaction on this date, I look at all their email and I can figure it out. You go to the transactional database, you get pretty easy to put those pieces together. Yeah. Now, you don't even know all the communications channels they may have been using, right? And from a compliance perspective, Bill, how do you, I'm just trying to understand, if you're doing surveillance, right, and it hits an email, how do you figure out all the other places that I should look, instead of just looking at the email and say, okay, here's a bad email, they use the word fraud or whatever, or they use an emoji or whatever. How do you connect all the dots? Do you have a process in place to do that?
Yeah, and I think it's the modern compliance officers really morphed, understanding and knowledge of industry rules and regulations is the base foundation of every compliance officer. I mean, that goes without saying. But we've come to a time where the compliance officer has to have this proficiency in technology, being aware of what's next or what has happened, because technology moves so much faster than we can move as a firm, faster than the regulators can move, and even the capture and retention and surveillance technology. So to answer your question, engaging all levels of your organization, having this open dialogue, because I think at the end of the day, we all want to protect our jobs, and part of that is not being hit with these multi-million-dollar fines.
If I could add to that, I think that the notion, though, of kind of how do you stay aware of where some communications may be moving, not new, right? So we've been talking about looking at lexicons that say text me or talk offline, or those things are pretty well understood. But the notion of channel hopping, or the fact that now, through more advances in analytics and communication surveillance, I can see where there's just sudden, abrupt changes in the flow of a conversation, or I talked at this frequency and suddenly that was just abruptly ended. Those are things that you couldn't do just by the review of a lexicon of the past. And so I think that's where you're seeing a lot of advances in technology and the acceleration of that because of the off-channel situation.
So I want to get to, because obviously this is a huge challenge, right? And I think one of the things, and we talked a little bit about this, we started with this, is these fines, and at least the impression from the regulators seems to be a focus on culture, right? We all know that it's almost impossible to monitor all of this, right? If they got fined for text messaging and WhatsApp, we could do as much as, each of these organizations can do as much as they can to try to capture it. But that doesn't solve the problem, right? Because they could always use a different line or whatever to do the same thing. So one of the issues that seems to be there, and which is where I think the fines, mostly the message was, you don't have a culture of compliance, right? So with this new environment where you have thousands of apps, people are using different technologies all the time and communicating, culture matters, right? So who wants to start with this? But how do you change a culture of an organization to be compliant, where senior executives are not texting people in the middle of the night knowing that it's not captured? Who wants to take that one in terms of how to change a culture?
I'm happy to start, but it definitely, in any organization, even outside of the financial industry, it starts from the top. And like I said, having these open dialogues at all layers of the organization is immense. And I think the regulators have started to also turn some heads as the onus has shifted from firms to individuals. I think that'll go a long way. But a lot of it's also, there's so much, we've heard a lot about AI, this is, fintech, it's a large focus of this, but there's so many wonderful AI-based training platforms that aren't, strong emotional outcomes, fear, humor, psychologists have proven it more effectively engages your hippocampus, the memory center of the brain. So, make training fun and engaging. Compliance is certainly no laughing matter, but we could increase retention by making more useful training.
I'll add a part of it, and and stop short of full-blown, you need to surveil everyone in the organization all the time. It's not that. But I think that if you look at just the language in the enforcement actions about the issues being widespread and pervasive, I think the actions a firm can take to demonstrate you are taking steps to improve visibility across the company. And if that means you have a surveillance pool of regulated users that, you've changed and updated the policies, but then if a senior executive is active on LinkedIn, there is a mechanism where you might be able to incorporate that into your review process. All day, every day, no, but if the executives are partaking in the control mechanism that's in place, I think that has an effect on the rest of the company.
So I have a question here, which is, I think, sort of goes to this idea, because they talk about a recent STLI report claimed that 15% of 170 senior compliance professionals within financial services firms are monitoring WhatsApp. So it's only 15% are monitoring WhatsApp. And the question is, why do you think there's this gap? Like, why isn't it 100%? And I think this sort of goes to the culture as well, because, and this is the hard part, right? Because I think many organizations, and I suspect many of these senior compliance folks say, we don't want our people communicating on WhatsApp, right? You have policies around it. So what are your thoughts on that? I don't know what your organization is doing, I don't know what you describe, but like what would be the reason? Because WhatsApp's just one. There's WhatsApp, we could go through a ton of different communications channels where clients are saying, I'd rather have as a policy, don't do this, instead of I'm going to capture. And I think that's a big decision for every organization, is how they want to do that. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of why you think the gap may be there, and particularly with WhatsApp and some of these other Snapchat, you go through like the gazillion Discord. I mean, you could come up with lots of different applications and communication channels that they're not monitoring. So
I mean, I think the fundamental trade-off is on being compliant and your desire to be responsive to the customer and efficiency. Yeah. So I think a part of that, addressing that is, again, addressing it comprehensively. Yes, we're not allowed to use this, but okay, here are alternatives. Yeah. If it happens, here are ways maybe you can steer it back to where it is. And again, it goes back to the culture of compliance that you mentioned. Clear communications, clear expectations that we are looking for this. If we find it, we're going to take this seriously, right? And if it inadvertently happens, we expect you to self-escalate. Those, I think, just making that clear from the top, but also down to the line managers.
Bill, your thoughts?
Yeah, that was the first time I heard that number, 15%. I think that's pretty shocking to me. But there has to be some sort of limitation. I mean, there's so many platforms out there of the same value presentation, if you will. So there's comparable platforms. Maybe someone doesn't want to use, a firm doesn't want to approve WhatsApp. Why not Telegram? Or there's numerous channels. So, I mean, there has to be, as you said, you have to be firm when the violation's found. If an off-channel communication is found, encourage your employees to self-report. That's one thing. But also strictly enforcing your policies and procedures. They're there for a reason.
I'd agree with both comments, but I think just what's clear is that this is not new. Compliance gaps have always existed. It used to be personal devices or Gmail. It moves. And so if it's not WhatsApp, it's going to be Tribal or Mastodon or whatever. So I think a good place to start, and just one reinforcement point to that, we just did a survey of RAAs and found that 35% of RAAs are capturing text messages. 35%. Small sample, but still, that astounded me. It's like, who really isn't using text messaging or using their mobile devices? So I think the issue is first understanding why that's happening. Is it because individuals are trying to avoid detection, or is it just your policy isn't properly defined, people don't understand the consequences? I mean, digging into why it's happening is kind of step zero. If it's just people have the expectation that they're going to use their own tools because that's what's allowed by the firm, then it goes back to the culture of compliance issue, that making sure that your executives are kind of redirecting down the right path.
Yeah, and look, I do think, frankly, I'm not surprised that 15% of WhatsApp and 35% of text messaging. Why? There's a cost associated with this, right? There's a cost associated with trying to capture all of this stuff. Just from a process perspective, getting it there, volume, all that kind of stuff. So again, I think most organizations that I know have policies that say don't use text messaging, except for sort of administrative stuff. So there's always some little caveat. And I think the same with WhatsApp. I think one of the reasons why I imagine it's very small number is that unless you're a global organization WhatsApp isn't really being used that much, right? If you're in Europe and you're in WeChat, if you're in APAC, that's what they use, right? And so I think global organizations are probably much more likely to have more different types of communications channels because you sort of have to match the culture. I think to your point, when the customers are sending you WhatsApps, your business is going to say, I need to be on WhatsApp. And we have the same thing with WeChat. I mean, I think in APAC, some of the government regulators only communicate with WeChat. So when you say, we're not allowing WeChat in Asia, then the government regulators say, well, we're sending you information by WeChat. You have to have that exception. So I think that's one of the challenges. Like when people talk about you have to capture this stuff, I don't think that's the answer. I think it's culturally you have to decide what do you want to do, right? There may be a business reason for it, but I do think the danger of, and I'll repeat this, the danger of saying we're going to capture all communications, you're setting yourself up for failure. There's no way you can capture all communications, right? There's just too many. I can tell you, we're doing an analysis of, for one financial institution, we've gone through, I think, 278 applications. A huge chunk of them have what you would call electronic communications in them. So we're turning some off, we're disabling it, we have a policy that says don't use it. I mean, there's no way you could capture all of that. Yeah. So.
But Anthony, I think you're also looking at the fact that even after you make that yes/no decision, I think the regulators are still going to be asking the question, how are you remediating deficiencies? Which means, do you really know that people aren't using that, even if you've said no?
Yeah.
So this is where I think there's a lot of power in the communication surveillance technology and just being able to see where there's indicators or breadcrumbs. It looks like there's a problem out there that we need to address. So I think use of the technology, I mean, the SEC and FINRA are using surveillance technology. Yeah. And I think their expectation is becoming clear. They're expecting firms to do the same.
Yeah. Yeah. But I do think that's an issue. So let's talk a little bit about technological advancements to help in this area. And I have a question on this as well on generative AI. But what technologies are you using from a surveillance perspective to sort of help you manage the fact that, maybe 2 years ago you were getting 5 million messages a day, and now it's going up to 10 million, and probably next year it's going to be 20 million, right? Like, how do you deal with the volume, the complexity? Like, what are the technological solutions? Because I don't think it's just a process solution or a policy solution or a cultural solution. There has to be a technological component. So what are you seeing, Laura?
Sure. On the surveillance side, machine learning is not new. It is, we've been using it, and ChatGPT may be new, but the technique behind it is not. Neural networks have been around. I think somebody made that point earlier. But I think what's potentially game-changing here is now we've been able to train, 175 billion parameters for language prediction. So I think that can help, but it's not sufficient, because if you really want to reduce volumes and really get at the good alerts, you have to get at more than just the text. Think, Robert, you mentioned the metadata. How are they talking? What are the maybe anomalous patterns in the behavior? And you got to connect not just the communications, the text. And this goes, I think, to what's important. Machine learning and AI. That's the sexy technologies, but what enables that is, does your enterprise have the requisite kind of like data structures, data governance? Because when you say, okay, I'm going to pull from different dots, that's when you actually try to implement that. Are you set up to do that? Are your data structures that way? Do you have sufficient entity resolution? Is it clean enough such that you can put these technologies on top of that? So that's what I would say. I mean, and the second piece is you have your data structures, but also a good model governance structure. I mean, this is good in the sense that we're a little bit ahead, that we have this, such that when new technologies come in, and there's going to be a new one after generative AI. I mean, this is not going to be the last one. But do you have a framework, basically, for ingesting and assessing the viability and applicability of these technologies as they come?
Yeah, and I think you hit on something pretty big there, that it isn't really the size. I mean, the size, just as the cost of cloud computing has gone down, it's not the size that is as much the issue. The scalability has become increasingly, it's easier to scale, it's easier to deploy, but it is the complexity. It is especially if you're an acquisition-based company, you're bringing in perhaps these legacy databases, and it's how do you massage that data? How do you keep it in a spot where it's accessible and usable on a large scale? And I think that's really where the AI machine learning comes in, where you're able to remove human bottleneck in the critical path of service and product delivery, so that your focus is less on the day-to-day, but more on the critical thinking, the problem solving, the creativity. I know that's something we had spoken about before stepping in here. AI, I don't know if it'll ever be able to replicate human creativity, and I think that's something to keep in mind here. But
I would counter it. I think it's both variety as well as complexity. Because on the variety side, I think somebody in an earlier panel said, if you don't have a clean data set to begin with, then your effectiveness later is just going to be, immediately measured or measurable. So the notion of, struggle number one is just keeping up with the false positives and the number of alarms or alerts that go off. If your data is not clean, that number is going to expand and explode. And so the first challenge was, how do you make it more efficient for your review team to get through the volume and variety they have to? I think that led to the more advanced use of technologies in surveillance that are very nicely complemented by the statement that failure to follow up on the red flags, i.e. you had so many alerts you couldn't follow up on, well, let me see how I can address the effectiveness through more advances in technology. So I think those two things have worked together to get people away from lexicons, or at least find ways they can complement what they're doing with lexicons with AI.
And just talk about, because you were talking about collecting the metadata around these is so important, which I think is absolutely true. So just to put a little finer point to it, one of the things that I see is identity management, right? So you have all these different communication channels. How do you identify, because you're looking for the person. You have one person that you're surveilling. You have the one bad actor. Just figuring out what is their identity within that organization, particularly if it's legacy, particularly if they're using all these different communications channels. So, like, for example, you could say I'm capturing text messaging. If that text messaging isn't attached to an identity, you're just getting a phone number and you have no idea who's there, right? And you don't no idea oftentimes with text messaging who the person on the other line is. So that is one of the challenges, right? As people start saying, oh, I'm just going to capture this stuff, capturing it and putting it in the archive is a very small portion. Like, that's the easy part. It's actually using it. And I think, so I guess in terms of just talking about it, like, what are the other data elements that you think are critical when you're collecting these communication channels and you're saying, okay, I'm going to try to capture this so that you can actually do adequate surveillance and you can do the work that you need to do?
If I could address a part of your question, which may be slightly different than what your question was intended for, but to me, that is one of the hidden challenges here, is the fact that the way that you capture is important. And what's important there is the dynamic nature of capture. Think about Twitter. Twitter changed its APIs. Now, because it wants to monetize its output, it's changed the way that you get access to the data. If you built a model last month with Twitter information, or even Microsoft, and suddenly that mechanism changes, you've got to revisit the way that the model works. So I think knowing how data is being captured, what the behaviors of the vendors are, what they want to do with their own versions of AI, because they will try to continually monetize that information. I think just knowing your vendor, doing the third-party risk due diligence is a critical part of being able to effectively deploy the right technologies in the back end.
And I mean, this may be too pointed a question, but do people here think that these financial institutions, investment advisors, understand the amount of resources that are necessary to actually do this? Because as we talked about, it's complex. You're going to have to do development work to get it in. You're going to have a team of people analyzing it, figuring it out. I think one of the things that I see is, I work with a lot of large organizations who are frankly resource constrained in this area, right? And they're trying to get budget to do some of this work. And it's hard and it's expensive. And when you think about smaller players, like, how are smaller players going to comply, right? If they had to do this, because a lot of these smaller players, broker-dealers, investment advisors, they're much smaller. They may have one person in legal, one person in compliance. And what we're talking about is a full-time job, right? Just to look at the communication channels, analyzing them, monitoring them. Is the API still working? Did things change? Who's doing it? I mean, it's an immense amount of resources that are needed to actually do this. Do you think that people are resourcing it adequately, I guess is the best way to describe it? Not talking about your organizations, just generally.
Well, I think data science teams would always want more resources. There's no limit to how much resources we want. But I think when you start trying to implement these things, you very quickly get the feedback if you're underinvesting, or if you're not doing it right, because it's not going to work, right? And then you'll just have to redo it. So hopefully you learn from experience of your peers, and what's out there, from also vendors, what their thoughts are. But yeah, I mean, it is it's not just the aggregate dollar amount that you put in it. It's the type. It's the whole. What are the different pieces that you need at various scales to be able to do this? I mentioned data. You got to have some level of even if you're using vendors, right? You got to have some level of expertise from a data and technology perspective within your own to challenge. I think in the panel this morning, the way they actually do the vendors, you have somebody sitting there and testing it. I think that was a great example, but to be able to do that, you have to have that in-house ability. But I think there are ways to do this, even if you're not, say, as big a bank as others.
Yeah, and something that came to mind there, it's really the quality of the junk in, junk out. And for these smaller firms, even in some of the larger firms that, you accumulated all of this data over time, but it's in a structure that isn't as easy to use and to process and to analyze. So I think for some of these smaller firms, building that firm foundation of just the quality of the data, making it so it could be leveraged, could, help solve some of these resource constraints down the road. But you still have to bite that bullet in the beginning to get the data in a form where it's going to be functional long term.
I'd argue that just in terms of resources, when we talk about model governance, it's a series of inputs and outputs and what's inside the model. I think that a lot of the energy and focus and conversations in forums like this are about what's inside the model and what comes out of the model, not where does the data come from and what are you doing to ensure, the vendor that's providing that data knows what your requirements are, that you have certainty or high level of comfort that there's no intellectual property issues or other things that come from where they gather their data. So I think the input side tends to be underappreciated. I think it's going to be discussed much more, in particular, just because now the variety of information people are trying to consume into the models, where it's clear if the outcome is, we have to start worrying about Signal or some other network, does that break the model entirely because it's not agile or able to respond to a change in the inputs that's being provided? So more focus, I think, should be coming there.
Yeah, and so there's two questions, and I think they're probably compatible. One is about, one was questions about what's on the horizon, and the next question is about generative AI, not in terms of the surveillance, but generative AI in chatbots in terms of electronic communication, right? This is clearly where the financial institutions are heading, where they're going to use these generative AI to answer, whether it's customer service, maybe giving it financial advice, which is scary, but they're going to try to automate a lot of the processes, particularly with customers and the like. And how is that going to impact everything you're doing in terms of surveillance? Like, who is the person on the? Do you have to have an identity for your chatbot so that you know which one may have violated securities laws, right? I mean, are you going to monitor this, right? That's, I think, really where we're heading is if it's not a person, but it's a model, is that something that you're actually going to have to capture and surveil to make sure that it's compliant?
I mean, risk controls are always going to have to be in place. Technology isn't perfect. Maybe it's a little fantastical, trying to think of some of these sci-fi films, but there's risk. There's risk with the technology. Perhaps risk is always going to exist. It may shift. It may change in its, core nature, but it's always going to exist, whether it's human or whether it's technology-based. So, not to get too specific into the capture, but you need risk controls, without question.
I think Brandon mentioned this earlier this afternoon, and I think there's really three variables to consider here in terms of where regulation goes. One is who has access to the model. Second, what's the use case? And third, what is it providing in terms of either information or it's enabling action? Because there you see whether it's, tripping into communications with the public, market suitability, other things if externally accessible, and if it's just for internal purposes, can there be infractions that take place with its use, whether that's, bad behaviors that may be, inside of where that interaction is taking place. So I think the questions of capture and retention will follow depending on those three variables, but then should you surveil some of those various use cases? I think that's the hard question, depending upon who your regulatory body oversight entities are. I think that'll vary, but best practice indicates you have to have visibility into what these things do, how individuals are interacting with them, and what are the consequences of misuse.
And if you develop an AI bot that is designed to avoid the surveillance, I could totally see that happening, right? Hey, we'll do the same.
Yeah, at the very least.
Use exactly the terms that they know because they see they're both being trained by the same thing.
That's right. At the very least, you have to be aware of its usage, right? To the extent that you're able to do that. But in terms of the surveillance, question becomes, does it map to the risk, right? So the risk of trying to surveil, does it add to that customer protection, market practices that you mentioned? And, it would probably need to be surveilled.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that, again, people start missing, right? We talk about communications channels and the like. It's going back to foundational principles, right? What is the business process that we're worried about? Because not every communication is really covered, maybe from a broker-dealer perspective, but certainly from a regular, investment advisors, it's not every communication. It's certain types of communication, and really figuring out if we're using AI or whatever, what's the business process they're automating? And do we think there's risk there, right? It's not, is it a communication? Is it something that needs to be surveilled? And I think that's sometimes what gets lost is people are so now concerned about, is it electronic communication, so we should capture it? Not saying, what is the purpose of the communication? What's the business process? Do we think the regulators are going to care about it?
And if you keep your eye on the ball of the risk that you're trying to mitigate and look for, then you start asking the right questions. And when you have that, then the technology follows. Because the good news is there's a lot of technology that's great, even before ChatGPT. If you want to go network analysis, we have that already. If you want to do kind of like sentiment analysis, that's been done along. So you have all of these pieces. It's just a matter of which ones do you need for the problem you're solving if you're thinking of it the right way.
Any other final thoughts? We have just a minute left. So.
Well, I think just back to the principle-based approach, I think one of the key things that firms should be considering is this is not just your own development effort. It's where applications you currently use may be embedding these capabilities that you need to have visibility into. So it kind of comes back to the point of third-party risk management and making sure that you really have a good read on their technological directions, what disclosures are they providing. You saw what happened with Zoom, a couple of weeks ago. So I think the energy there around everything else that's running inside of your environment, making sure you have visibility into those things that risk may have embedded.
Bill?
Yeah, I mean, for many of the vendors here, I think it's, will you allow the FIs to look under the hood more or less, and is that logic defensible to the regulators? I think that's a big part of it. But
Laura?
Explainability. I mean, we haven't even touched on that, but that was it. I mean, that is a big, consideration when you're thinking of, whether the right tools and whether to go in-house or buy. Right, build or buy, because if you build it, you know it, you control it to the extent. But maybe there's a happy middle ground in there, because I can see certain things that if it's already been built, if it's pretty much a gadget, might make sense to buy it, with the caveats that Bill mentioned. If we can have, if not full under the hood, at least traceability. Right? Yeah. Can you trace it?
And the constraint being that you're never going to be able to interrogate the gadget, if there was an issue, right? So it's how can you at least have someone that can explain what it's doing, or confine it to very low risk applications where its damage can be controlled or limited.
All right. So the good news is, I guess, nobody is fully compliant right now. The bad news is nobody is fully compliant, but we're all in the same boat. So with that. We've got a lot of work to do. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.